In this presentation, we will look in a cursory way at two other Greek non-indicative moods, the subjunctive mood and the optative mood. It is very important that we remember that in all non-indicative moods in Greek, aspect rather than time of action is what is most important in the so-called tense of a given verb. In the indicative mood, present, aorist, imperfect, perfect, future, all spoke to the relative time of the action that was named by a particular form. Outside of the non-indicative mood, once again, it is the quality of the action that these tenses name, not the time of the action. Thus, when we're dealing with the aorist tense in the subjunctive or the optative, just as with the imperative and infinitive, we are talking about a tense that names the action without further nuance. But if we encounter a present subjunctive or present optative, we are encountering a form that emphasizes the action as something that is in progress, in process, that is habitual, that is ongoing, that is somehow unfolding over time, and is highlighting that aspect of it. With the infinitive, it was the difference between to read as an aorist infinitive and to continue to read or to keep on reading as a present infinitive. That same difference in nuance will be present, will be noticeable in the subjunctive and the optative. The perfect tense will be important again for the participle, as it was in fact for the infinitive, but there are not perfect subjunctives or perfect optatives of note in the New Testament. However, for the sake of completeness, when we do encounter a perfect non-indicative verb in Greek, the emphasis is on a completed action, often emphasizing the results of that action, the change that that action has brought about. So one says in Greek, I have come to believe, and that actually is an example of an indicative mood translation, but one says, I have come to believe, in order also to emphasize the fact that I believe now. A change has taken place and now there's a different result. As opposed to saying, I believed at some point in the past that action was true, but to say I believed doesn't really say anything about where you are now. Whereas to use the perfect tense, I have believed, does say something about where you are now as a result of that action. As we turn to the subjunctive mood, we essentially turn to a mood that is used in a variety of constructions or a variety of ways, and there is no real way to communicate a kind of root sense of the subjunctive mood in the way that we were able to do with the indicative mood, where we could say the indicative mood is used to name actions that are being presented as factual actions, whether the claim is to historicity or not. That is to say, I might recount what I did last week, and I would use the indicative mood because I'm presenting the actions as factual. I could recount a completely made-up story, like the story of the Iliad, but I would also use the indicative mood because I was relating those stories as if they were actual actions, simply narrating the story. Whether it's true or not doesn't much matter. We could say of the imperative mood that it's the mood of command. It calls actions into being. There really isn't a kind of root sense of the subjunctive, although you might encounter in some grammars the suggestion that the subjunctive mood is the mood for probable action. I would simply say it's the mood for actions that aren't yet real at the time of a main action or at the time of utterance. But the bottom line is, with the subjunctive mood, the most reliable course of action is simply to hold together the bundle of its actual uses and not try to cloud that, I think, with some abstraction about what its underlying sense is. And so we will look at two basic bundles of uses of the subjunctive mood. One set are known as independent uses because in these instances the subjunctive mood verb functions as the main verb of the main clause. It is the independent verb. And we will then look in a little bit at uses of the subjunctive in dependent clauses. That would be in clauses that, if you eliminate everything else in the sentence, would leave you with an incomplete sentence. But first, the independent uses, where the subjunctive verb is the verb of the main clause. One very common usage of the subjunctive is the hortatory subjunctive. It is the use of the subjunctive to exhort a group of people, including oneself, to some action. The hortatory subjunctive will almost always appear in the first person plural form, the we form of a verb. Very occasionally, but quite unnaturally, it might occur in the first person singular. But in the New Testament, the overwhelming number of uses of a hortatory subjunctive, if I had surveyed them better, I could probably say all, but I'll just say almost all, will be first person plural forms, we forms, or us, let us forms. And so you have these examples, all of which provide us with English renditions, but good English renditions, of hortatory subjunctives. In 1 John 4:7, a hortatory subjunctive gives us, let us keep on loving one another. Now, in that particular translation, I noted that it was a present subjunctive, and I didn't want to render it the way, so many English translations render it as, beloved, let us love one another, which is really no better than one would do if it were an aorist hortatory subjunctive. So to bring that sense of the present aspect, the action in progress or action ongoing aspect of the present tense, I would render it, beloved, let us keep on loving one another. Or, in Hebrews 12, verse 1, let us keep on running the race with perseverance. Once again, you might be familiar with this from English Bibles as, let us run the race with endurance or with perseverance. But it's another present subjunctive. So really, to give it its full nuance in English, let us go on running. Let us keep on running the race with perseverance. And then a final example from Luke chapter 2, verse 15, where the shepherds, having been visited by an angelic messenger and then the angelic hosts singing glory to God, say, let us go to Bethlehem and let us see this thing. And here, let us go, let us see, are good representations of two aorist subjunctives in that particular verse. Bottom line here being that the subjunctive mood, especially first person plural forms of the subjunctive mood, can be used to express exhortation to oneself and those about one, such as we encounter in English Bibles all the time with, let us do this, let us do that. Another major use independent uses of the subjunctive would be the subjunctive of prohibition. This is where you encounter a second person, aorist usually, subjunctive, whether it be singular or plural, with the word may, which is the word used to negate all verbs outside of the indicative mood. It is the equivalent of not or don't outside of the indicative mood, whereas oo or ook are the equivalent of not with indicative mood verbs. So, we had encountered imperatives, which are the typical mood of commands, including negative commands. Don't do that. Imperatives will also be negated with may. However, Greeks might use may with an aorist subjunctive to make an even stronger command, a categorical negative command. Don't do that. So in Matthew 10:26, we would find may with a subjunctive form, an aorist subjunctive form of the verb for fearing, to say, don't fear them. Don't ever fear them. Just don't go in that direction at all. Or in Hebrews 3:8, and again in 3:15, don't harden your hearts. There, instead of the expected imperative form, we have may with the aorist subjunctive to create an even sterner prohibition of an action. A third independent use of the subjunctive is the subjunctive of emphatic future negation. You will recognize this use right off because it will be negated with both oo and may, both the form of the word not, that is typically associated with indicative verbs, and the form for not associated with non-indicative verbs, oo may. And oo may with the subjunctive is a way of expressing the conviction that a particular action will simply never happen. It is used to make a very strong assurance about something not occurring in the future. And so in Hebrews, to go there again, in Hebrews 8:12, which quotes a line from the Septuagint version of Jeremiah 31, we have oo may and the subjunctive to express, I will never remember their sins any longer. I will certainly no longer remember their sins. It's an emphatic assurance about some action not happening in the future. Similarly, in Hebrews 13:5, oo may with a subjunctive form of the verb is used to express, I will never ever leave you. I will never ever forsake you. Translations rarely go all out to capture this nuance. They might read instead, I will not remember their sins anymore, or I will not leave you, I will not forsake you. But really that's just not strong enough. The Hebrew author could have simply used oo with a future indicative to say, I will never leave you. But by choosing oo may with a subjunctive, the author is choosing a more emphatic form. I will never, ever leave you. And that can often be an exegetically relevant observation. Now, another, and the last major independent use of the subjunctive occurs when the speaker is asking him or herself, either singly or asking him or herself and the group around him or her, a question. Shall we do something? Should I do this? Shall we do that? And it can be a real question. It can be simply a rhetorical question, which the speaker will go on to answer, or simply assume that the audience knows how to answer, and go on from there. But, again, to give a few examples, where in Romans 6:1 we read, should we continue in sin? Paul asks that question using a first-person plural subjunctive. It could be mistaken for a hortatory subjunctive, let us continue in sin, were it not for the presence of a question mark in the Greek text, which clues us in, if the meaning and content didn't clue us in already, that Paul is asking a question, not trying to rally toward a certain action. So, should we continue in sin in order that grace might abound? Heck no, he goes on to answer. Or in Luke 3, verse 10, after John the Baptist announces the forthcoming judgment, those who are listening to him are wondering how to meet it, and so they ask, what are we to do? This is a deliberative subjunctive, a first-person plural subjunctive form that really is an open-ended, a true question looking for an answer from John, some specific instructions. So these four would be our independent uses of the subjunctive. The hortatory subjunctive, let us do this, or let us not do this. Closely related, the deliberative subjunctive. Should we do this? Shall we do this? Should I continue to do this? Whether it's a real question or a rhetorical question. The subjunctive used to express an emphatic prohibition. Don't even think of doing that. Here, may with a second person, either singular or plural, subjunctive. And then finally, the subjunctive of emphatic future negation, ou and may with a subjunctive. And I would kind of make that notation, perhaps both in writing and in my mind. When I see ou and may and a subjunctive, I'm looking at a future, an emphatic future negation or emphatic future denial. This will certainly never happen, or this will certainly no longer happen. There are also a number of dependent uses of the subjunctive, that is to say, when a subjunctive is used as a principal verb in a dependent clause, a subordinate clause, the clause that, if you took away the rest of the sentence, would simply be a sentence fragment. And one of the very common uses of the subjunctive in such clauses is to express purpose. And again, in this instance, we have a key word that will clue us in that a subjunctive is first expected, and second, will be functioning to express purpose. And those are the keywords hina or hapos. Hina being by far the most common, or the more common, of the two in the Greek New Testament, but hapos is also worth filing away in our memories, so that when we see hina or hapos, we know we're going to be looking at a clause that talks about purpose. Very rarely result. There is another formula for that, which we learned in connection with the infinitive mood, hoste, with the infinitive. But arguably there are some examples of hina or hapos clauses that don't necessarily express intentionality in regard to the main action. The main action was undertaken in order that the secondary action, the subjunctive action, should come to pass. In a few instances, it can be argued that the action of the main clause happened simply with the result that, so that the action of the subjunctive in this hina or hapos clause happened. but generally purpose. And so for some examples, we could go back to Romans 6:1, where in the first half of that sentence we have a deliberative subjunctive, one of the independent uses. Should we continue in sin? Should we continue, being a deliberative subjunctive. And then hina with a subjunctive in the second half of the verse. Should we continue in sin in order that grace may abound? The in order that there is a translation of hina, and may abound is a subjunctive form of a verb for abounding. So an expression of a purpose clause. Similarly, in Hebrews 13, verse 12, therefore Jesus also suffered outside the gate in order that he might sanctify the people. In order that, again, hina, signaling a purpose clause, and the subjunctive form of sanctify, he might sanctify. And then, just one other note here. Hina can express either positive or negative purposes, in order that something might happen, or in order that something might not happen, in which case you would have hina and may with a subjunctive. But sometimes, not often, but sometimes, may with a subjunctive in a dependent clause like this may be used without hina or hapos to express essentially negative purpose, like do this lest that happen. Obviously, even in English, lest communicates, so that not, so that something doesn't happen. This is, as I said, rare, but it does happen. And you'll know that you're looking at an instance where may with the subjunctive is essentially a negative purpose, because it'll be in a dependent clause and not the main verb of the sentence, in which case this construction would typically be a prohibition if it's a second person verb, a you form of a subjunctive. A quite different usage of the subjunctive happens in general and hypothetical conditional clauses. If ever this happens, that will happen. If this should ever happen, that would happen. And in this kind of formula, you would find the word eon signaling that you're looking at a general, hypothetical conditional clause. And eon will precede a subjunctive form of the verb. Eon is itself a combination of a word meaning if, a, and a word that never gets translated, on. But on is a little particle, a Greek particle, that marks indefiniteness or generality, hence general condition, aeon. So in 2 Corinthians 3:17, if ever anyone turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. And we have aeon with the subjunctive because we're not naming an actual action. We're setting up a hypothetical case. If ever this happens, that happens. If ever anyone turns to the Lord, the veil is taken away. Or, similarly in Matthew 5:23, if ever you are offering your gift in front of the altar and happen to remember that your brother or sister has something against you, all of that is a clause introduced by eon with two subjunctives, one for you are offering and one for you remember, as part of this set of hypothetical conditions that precede the command. If ever this happens, leave your gift and go. Now, a related use of the subjunctive might show up when you have not just eon, but some other word before it, which typically means who, when, or where. So a relative pronoun might appear before eon, and I don't want to ask you to think about those forms, but they tend to be identified in grammatical handbooks and commentaries and things. And I believe on Logos also, if the word shows up as who or which or that, in certain senses that, then we're looking at a relative clause. So a relative pronoun with eon becomes whoever might do this. Or hoton, which is a combination of the word for when, hote, plus on, becomes whenever. Or hapu, which means where. If that's combined with eon, hapu eon, it would mean wherever. And these words, these constructions would also be followed by a subjunctive to show, again, that we're looking at essentially a general conditional clause. The great example for the wherever is in the Septuagint, in fact, Ruth 1:16, wherever you might go, I will go. Again, key words will help you think about the major categories of uses of the subjunctive. In regard to dependent uses, the key words hina and hapos, which signal a purpose clause in order that X might happen. And for the general, hypothetical, conditional sentences, the key word aeon, if ever, followed by a subjunctive. So once again, as I try to wrap my mind around the various uses of the subjunctive, I would zero in on these key words that we've identified and make note of them, that when they appear followed by a subjunctive, that's signaling this kind of use. And that will leave you with really just a few other uses of the subjunctive to learn how to identify, namely the hortatory, the deliberative, and then the subjunctive of prohibition. But those are rather limited, for example, to particular persona numbers. So you will be able to map those out in your notes as well, using these resources here. I want to think with you very briefly about the optative mood. Briefly, because it's rather rare in the New Testament. There are only about 70 optative forms in the whole New Testament. And many of those are stereotyped expressions. The optative, unlike the subjunctive, we can define in an abstract sort of way. The mood itself tends to refer to potential action, something that might happen, an action that is possible, or an action that we might wish to happen, which is still simply in the realm of possibility and no further than that. So the optative is used to express wishes. May this happen. Or not. May this never happen. To express a possible action. It might happen. Or, in certain conditional sentences, like the ones we were looking at, only even murkier in regard to the future. If this should ever happen, that would happen. I really should have written would here instead of will. If this should ever happen, that would happen. But what are the chances? We have examples of the optative of wish, for example, in Luke 1:38, where Mary responds to the angel, "May it happen to me according to your word. May it be to me as you have said." Or very frequently in benedictions, in the epistolary texts of the New Testament. For example, in Romans 15, "May the God of hope fill you with all joy." There, may and fill are English representations of an optative form. Optatives of wish. The stereotyped example is me genoito, which Paul uses very frequently when he's getting into some argument and he proposes a possible conclusion and rejects it. Should we continue in sin so that grace might abound? Me genoito, may it not be. So it's a kind of stereotypical or formulaic optative of wish. May it not happen. May it not be. And that, I haven't tallied them up, but I would almost bet that would account for about a third of the examples of the optative in the New Testament. And then benedictions, like Romans 15, would account for another large portion of them. There are a few potential optatives in the New Testament. The optative of wish is distinguished from the potential optative, the optative that simply names a possible action, by virtue of the fact that the latter, the potential optative, is usually, not always, but usually accompanied by the particle on. Again, that particle that marks indefiniteness. So the Ethiopian eunuch in Acts 8 responds to the question of Philip, do you understand what you're reading? With a potential optative, how would I be able? How is it a possibility? Unless someone shows me the way. And in Luke 6:11, when opposition begins to be stirred up against Jesus, they began to discuss with one another what they might do to Jesus. And the word for they might do is an optative because it is discussing possible actions that could be taken to get rid of Jesus. And one example of the optative in one of these future, less vivid conditional sentences, one of these sentences along the lines of, if this should ever happen, that would happen. But we're not presenting these as likely circumstances or their consequences. In 1 Peter 3:15, even if you should suffer, even if you might suffer for the sake of righteousness, you will be blessed. The you might suffer, and the if clause, is an optative, a potential optative. If this should happen, as it turns out, Peter doesn't use an optative in the second half. He uses a future indicative, simply strengthening then the proclamation of that consequence. You will be blessed. Perhaps because the author knows that many among his audience are, in fact, suffering some level of deprivation because of their faith commitment for the sake of righteousness. Now again, with the optative, as with the subjunctive, the difference between an aorist tense and a present tense is significant. When an author chooses the aorist tense, he or she is just drawing attention to the action. But if he or she chooses a present tense, he or she is communicating more about that action by virtue of having chosen that form. So if Romans 15:13 used a present optative, which it doesn't, it does in fact use an aorist optative. This is just an example. If it were a present optative, we would do better thinking of this action as, may the God of hope keep filling you with all joy. May the God of hope fill you again and again with all joy. So that difference of aspect still remains significant and still remains something that translations tend to neglect bringing out, leaving it for you to discover and bring into your own study or discussions of the text with others.